What is addiction? Addiction is a sign, a symptom that something is inherently wrong with the individual. It's a cry for help. It's it's a weird statement put out wherein the thing that is the thing that is most affected, the brain, is self-aware of the damage it is causing and yet is unable to do anything to prevent further harm. In definition, that is, addiction can be anything: substance use or any behavior related activity that is repeated so often to the detriment of the individual indulging in it, and one that the individual continues to do so in spite of knowing the harmful effects it brings forth. Now, when we talk about addictions, we cannot ignore substances. And substances can be any chemical formulations that is intended to give you a high, a stimulant. Almost all the drugs and the alcohol come under a substance, while behavioral addictions are of a different kind. Behavioral addictions are activities. It could be gambling, it could be compulsive social media usage, it could be pornography, it could be praying, it could be using work, it could be going to the gym. Any activity that you indulge so frequently and to such an extent that it is causing you more harm, that's an addiction. And I know it's a fair question to ask. If that's what is addiction, then how do you differentiate passion from addiction? Because what else is passion? Something that you so obsess over that you spend day and night in the pursuit of it. So how do you differentiate passion from addiction? It's quite simple, actually. You just got to ask and find out who the person in charge is. You or the behavior. If you can stop at any point and actually stick to your promise, then you're in charge and it's just a passion. But if you cannot stop, or if you try to stop and you convince yourself to stop, but in reality you cannot stay away, the behavior wins, then that's an addiction. And the literature on it is quite evident that a certain category of people are more predisposed to developing addiction. These are people who have had what can only be considered as troublesome and traumatic childhoods, where the early caregivers, the parents, have either emotionally, physically, mentally, psychologically, sexually abused or fostered an environment where the child has grown up with traumas. Just like how the fetus is infused within the womb of a woman, so is the child, so is the young child in the early formative years is infused to the home environment created by the parents. And a child growing up in a traumatic childhood, in a traumatic household, it messes with the circuitry and the wiring within the brain, because the brain of a child at that young age is extremely malleable, and it interferes with the development of both the dopamine circuitry and the opioid circuitry, and in essence the child grows up not knowing how to deal with stress properly, not knowing how to manage his impulses. Impulse control is severely lacking in such children. And now adults or adolescents who use various substances or try out behavior patterns which then become an addiction. And it's not always the trauma created by parents, overt, in your face trauma that is the cause. Sometimes it's just absentee fathers and mothers that also leads up to these that predisposes certain children towards a later on addiction potentiality. Parents who are absentees, parents who do not take an active effort in the rearing of a child, such children are more prone to risk of developing an addiction much later. But then, if you look into the statistics, you'll see that a lot of the addicts never had trauma, didn't have parents who were emotionally or psychologically distant from them, and still they managed to develop an addiction later in life, which when we question and think about, it just points to how human beings over the time have always reacted and responded to external stresses. Life is difficult. Life is painful. In an ultra competitive world where resting for a minute runs the risk of you losing out on the race, where everything is hyper commercialized, where you're constantly felt where you're constantly feeling left out and constantly having to compare your lives with absolute strangers living across the seas and across the lands, people that you have never met and you're never going to meet, but still feel like your life is inferior and pathetic to those people. Of course, you're going to want to find a way to deal with that emptiness, that loneliness, that hopelessness, that inner despair of why do I exist? What is the meaning to my life? And how else, what better way to deal with that immense pain than to numb yourself through opioids, or to numb your senses through mindless scrolling and compulsive shopping and indulging in promiscuous sex and become a worker, becoming a workaholic. It is, it is said that the addicts aren't people who turn to an addiction to get a high or to get some pleasure out of it. To the contrary, addicts are people who turn to addiction to numb the pain. They don't do it for the pleasure. At least not in the start, not in the beginning. They turn to it to reduce the various neurotic conditions, the anxieties and the depressions that they are facing, the stresses that they are facing. In the Buddhist principles, the human experience is portrayed as a circle of life consisting of 6 stages. And one of the stages it's called the realm of the hungry ghost. And this particular stage is occupied by these scrawny creatures with oddly shaped heads and emaciated limbs and a big belly. A big belly that, however it consumes, it never is satiated, never gets satisfied. This is this realm where addicts live. No matter how much you take in, no matter how much you consume, you're always left wanting more. Addiction is a challenge because the more the addict uses substance or indulges in a certain behavior pattern, it interferes with the organ, the brain, the one thing that is desperately trying to correct itself but fails every time because of the excess use of the substance or the overindulgence of a behavior pattern. It is a challenging predicament that all concerned parties, all healthcare professionals and social workers and society at large and the government face when it comes to addiction and addicts. There's no positive message that I can end this on other than saying that if we open up our hearts and see the addicts as people suffering from a disease, then perhaps we would be more lenient in our approach to them. Because all of us have been addicts at one point or the other. Sure, your addiction may not have required a clinical intervention, but you were an addict. Perhaps you still are. Something about people living in glass houses not throwing stones at others. Compassion.